Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be talking about and analysing a poem by the wonderful 20th century poet Philip Larkin. This is part 2 of my lecture on Philip Larkin's poetic style, and here I'm going to analyse one of his most beautiful poems, I think, Nothing to be Said, which seems incredibly bleak, perhaps when you first read it, but I want to unpick it in a bit more detail and see perhaps if there is some sense of comfort that we can take from the poem. It was published in his Whitsun Weddings collection from 1964. This poem itself, Nothing to be Said, was written in October 1961. In this part of the lecture then, I'm going to first read through the poem Nothing to be Said, and then I'm going to move on to the literary analysis and close reading. In particular, I'm going to be looking at his use of anaphora, his use of epistrophe, his use of zeugma, his use of aural echoes, so a kind of internal rhyme, and anti-metaboly, which is a kind of chiasmus. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what all those literary terms are. And then I'm going to close by contemplating whether or not I think this poem is as bleak as it might at first appear. Is there some hope that we can take from this poem? Nothing to be Said by Philip Larkin. For nations vague as weed, for nomads among stones, small-statured, cross-faced tribes, and cobble-close families. In mill towns on dark mornings, life is slow dying. So are there separate ways of building, benediction, measuring love and money, ways of slowly dying. The day spent hunting pig or holding a garden party, hours giving evidence or birth, advance on death equally slowly. And saying so to some means nothing. Others it leaves nothing to be said. To start with the overall structure then, there is a different focus in each of the three stanzas. So the first stanza concerns people, nations, nomads, tribes, families. The second stanza concerns the activities of those people, the different ways that they spend their days, they spend their time. So building projects, or building homes, or what they kind of do, what they're trying to make, what they're trying to build. Benediction, so how they worship, how they pray. Measuring love and money, so they spend their time kind of measuring or valuing these things. Then the third stanza moves on to and kind of divides people into those who are aware and those who aren't. So that saying so to some means nothing, so on one hand you have those people, and then other people, for others it leaves nothing to be said. The poem starts with anaphora. So anaphora is where you repeat the same structure at the beginning of successive clauses. So here we have for nations, for nomads. By using anaphora, Larkin is directly comparing those two things, so nations and nomads, and they're about as different as you can sort of think of them to be. So it compares the complex society and the kind of construction that is a nation, which is an international governmental institution. So for nations, and then on the other hand, for nomads, and nomads are individuals that are kind of broken down to the most sort of solitary level. A nomad lives outside of society. So on the one hand you've got for nations, and then you've got for nomads. So for those two and for everyone in between, the same thing applies to both of those kind of groups. And in both these lines they end with nature imagery. So for nations vague as weed is the natural image there, and for nomads among stones. So weeds and stones, this nature imagery, which is compared to the kind of humanity or the focus on the human that is a nation or a nomad. So individual and society in nature, we've got here in these two opening lines. And both these kind of human elements at the beginning for nations, for nomads, are kind of mocked by the word that connects them to the nature imagery. So in the first line you have kind of the mockery within vague. So it mocks how humans try to categorise the world. For nations vague as weed. So it's mocking how humans try to categorise the world and implement these sort of grand structures, grand governmental structures and institutions, and yet, you know, they sort of try to escape the natural by making these very artificial structures, and yet still nations are as vague as weed. Did all that work to implement a nation, and still it's just as vague as a weed. And what does that really mean? For nations vague as weed. It's quite an odd image. And I think what that means is when you see a kind of overgrown patch of land, you can't tell necessarily which is which. You don't know what the weed is. You just sort of know that it's a weed. You can't necessarily, unless you're a great sort of botanist, you can't necessarily classify every weed you see. So it's just as vague as that when you're looking down on earth from a position of death, and you might see that the speaker of this poem, the voice of this poem, as being death, perhaps, although I'm not sure. But when you're looking down at nations, kind of grand way of categorising the world as nations, then they're just as vague as a human walking along and looking at some weed. So that vague is mocking the apparent kind of imposing of structure that is a nation. And for nomads among stones, the nomad is being mocked by the word among, because a nomad is supposed to be kind of escaping others, wants to be kind of solitary and alone, and yet it is still among. So it's included within, among the natural. So it's, a nomad is still among stones. It isn't completely, a nomad is not completely isolated and actually alone. You're still among nature. So the poem opens then with that kind of comparison between the human trying and nature, and not kind of escaping nature. And then we have another kind of comparison, which is represented aurally. So we have the kind of vague as weed. Those are long vowels, vague as weed. And that's in comparison to the consonant-heavy compounds, very particular descriptions that come later in the stanza. So small-statured, cross-faced, cobble-close, mill-towns. Those compounds, so the hyphen putting two things together is a compound. So those compound phrases are kind of short and compact and full of consonants. So we're moving from nations and nomads being kind of vague as weed to much more particular, much more local, much more small descriptions, small-statured, cross-faced tribes, cobble-close families, mill towns, dark mornings. So we've got that aural comparison going on in this opening stanza as well. And what does that comparison do? It shows that, and we'll see this throughout the poem, Larkin tries a number of ways to show opposites, to show that two sets are kind of included in what it is that he's talking about. And that's represented kind of aurally here, in having the long vowels included with the short voweled consonant heavy compounds. And one of the things I would particularly draw your attention to in this opening stanza, which we'll see becomes important for understanding the whole poem, is the use of plurals. Nations, nomads, tribes, families, mill towns, dark mornings. These are all plurals. So it's a kind of collective, or the use of plurals suggests a collective experience. Kind of everyone is included in one of those things. You are in a nation, you are a nomad, or you're in a tribe, or you're in a family. But these are not particularised and individual. And these plurals kind of encompass and embrace all of humanity. Nations, nomads, tribes, families. Everyone lives in mournings. That sort of idea and the point of that, I think, is to show that death is shared by one and all. Whatever category you might be in, death comes to each of them. As we move into the second stanza, so are their separate ways. And in their separate, we have exactly this juxtaposition of the plural, the group, the collective, their, and the individual and the isolated and the kind of disparate in separate. And Larkin's use of the word life at the end of the first stanza I think is interesting. Life is slow dying. Because it's sort of unclear whether that life is singular or kind of collective. So you have all life is slow dying, as well as one's life being slow dying. And however you choose to spend your time, still your own one life is part of this collective life that is slow dying. Going back to this idea of plurals, so continues on from the first stanza into the beginning of the second stanza, and then at the close of the poem in the third stanza, in the final sentence, Larkin is still using some and others. So it's not saying, and saying so to one means nothing, to another it leaves nothing to be said. It's still couched in the plural. So you say this to some, and to others it leads. So there's still a sense of the collective going on into the end of the poem. So I spoke about the kind of aural connection in the first stanza, but that continues to some extent in the second stanza too, because we have the internal rhyme of ways, and day. So are there separate ways of building benediction, measuring love and money, ways of slow dying. So that's emphasis in the repetition on this just being one way of living life, one way of filling up the time until you die. Their separate ways, again, the collective, the individual, their separate ways. Whatever way you choose, it is a way only of slow dying. And that internal rhyme is then picked up again in day spent. So the day spent doing whatever is just a way. So the day is a way of slow dying. And you can even see, although it is the day, the fact that there's an S then in the next word, so spent, does, I think, to some extent pick up on ways. So it's not just the kind of assonance of the A sound, A-Y, so way and day. It's also the days spent, which I think you can see perhaps as being kind of an aural echo of ways, the days spent. So ways and days, you could say. Measuring is a key word in the second stanza, I think. So while others measure love and money, the narrative voice measures time. So at the end of the first stanza, you've got life, and then in the second stanza, you've got the day, and then at the beginning of the third stanza, you've got hours. So you go from life to the day to hours. It's kind of measuring out, parcelling out of time. And this word measuring is also important in the way that it uses zeugma. So zeugma comes from the Greek for yoking, and the kind of grammatically how it works is that it yokes together usually two nouns with a verb, so that the verb governs two different nouns. So as here, measuring, the verb measuring, yokes together the nouns love and money, and by doing that it encourages the reader or the listener to equate those two nouns that are being governed by the same verb in kind of some way, or to yoke them together. Linking love and money here, it's sort of the idea of measuring them equally. That love and money are both commodities to be assessed and measured in some way. And Larkin uses zeugma again at the beginning of the third stanza. Hours giving evidence or birth. So the verb giving yokes together evidence, giving evidence, and birth, giving birth. On the one hand, what's linked together here is the idea of giving evidence, which is, legal and is representative of the height of a sophisticated, cultured, ordered, developed society. If you're giving evidence, then there is a legal system in place, and it's all the proper procedures, and it's all coordinated and kind of institutionalized, and so on. And that's compared, through this use of zeugma, it's compared to giving birth, which is representative of the complete kind of opposite of something like a legal system. It's primitive, it's animalistic, it's basic, it's fundamental, it's natural. It's not kind of controllable by humans, that giving birth is this element of life, you could say. So we've got, in this use of zeugma then, we've got what you might see to some extent as a kind of mock heroic, mock epic playing with scale, because these two completely different things are yoked together through the use of giving evidence and giving birth. Larkin's use of birth here I think is particularly interesting in a poem that is about death, and yet birth kind of comes in to the poem in this zeugma, which links it to something as tedious and procedural as giving evidence. The line continues, or birth, advance on death. Birth is aligned with the tedious hours giving evidence, rather than being a kind of profound comfort in the face of death. So birth is not an antidote to the kind of pressure of contemplating death. That birth is merely, or giving birth is merely a way to fill up the hours before death. So the focus here is on the process of giving birth, rather than a focus on the symbolism of new life, which, a more abstract writer might do. That just thinking about birth is a way to console yourself in the face of death. But Larkin doesn't do that. Instead, birth is linked with something as tedious and procedural as giving evidence in court. Moving on to the closing sentence, and saying so to some means nothing, others it leaves nothing to be said. So again, Larkin is using an aural kind of echo in the assonance and the sibilance. So the assonance here is the E and the A sound in means and leaves. We've got the echo in the vowel sounds, and the ending of those two monosyllables with S. So the sibilance, so means, leaves. And that's picking up the alliteration of saying so to some. So we've got the sibilance at the beginning in saying so to some, which is then picked up in means and leaves. So we've got these kind of aural echoes going on. And then there's a strategic use of enjambment. So enjambment is when you have to go over the line, you have to read over the line in order for the clause to make sense in poetry. And here you've got means nothing, others it leaves. And that leaves, I would say, is strategic. So it leaves, pause, nothing. Means nothing, leaves nothing. That's what's kind of being picked out in the aural echoes, I would say. And the enjambment then kind of enhances, I would say, this idea of leaves. Also in this final closing sentence, we have anti-metaboly, which is a subgroup of chiasmus. And chiasmus is a structure, a sentence structure or a line structure, which is kind of balanced. A, B, B, A. It has that kind of structure. So there's a sense of harmony and balance. And you can see it sometimes as being a sense of kind of circularity, so that you end where you began. A, B, A, B, B, A. Chiasmus is kind of derived from the Greek for crossing, and you can kind of see that in the imagery. It sort of crosses over each other. This balanced grammatical structure, as I've said, A, B, B, A. In chiasmus, the words used can be similar but not identical. So, for example, some Shakespeare, Iago in Othello says, "Who dotes yet doubts, suspects yet strongly loves." It's a beautiful example of chiasmus, beautiful alliteration in dotes and doubts, suspects and strongly loves. But you can see the A, B, B, A structure. So dotes and strongly loves are similar, and doubts and suspects are strongly similar. So dotes A, doubts B, suspects B, strongly loves A. Anti-metaboly is a, as I've said, type of chiasmus. So it has this A, B, B, A structure, but the words are the same. So you repeat the same words in the line of anti-metaboly. One for all and all for one is a famous example. Another famous example is by Lord Byron in his poem Don Juan from Canto 1, which was published in 1819. Pleasure's a sin, and sometimes sin's a pleasure. That's anti-metaboly. How does Larkin use anti-metaboly here in the poem Nothing to be Said? Well, and saying so to some means nothing, others it leaves nothing to be said. So the A, B, B, A structure here is saying nothing, nothing said. But both kind of parts of this sentence, both parts of the anti-metaboly, effectively end in nothing. Saying so to some means nothing. It ends in nothing because they don't understand what you're saying. The second, to others, it leaves nothing because they don't have anything to add. Stylistically suggesting that this is a perpetual end of the conversation, that it's almost kind of cyclical, this conundrum that you're faced with, that saying so to some doesn't mean anything because they don't understand you, and saying so to others means that they're kind of so paralysed by the thought that there's nothing more to be said. So both end in nothing. You say something, there's nothing to be said. You say something, there's nothing to be said. You say something, there's nothing to be said. So the structure then adds to the sense of redundancy almost, that you just end up where you've begun. So there's kind of no point in trying to say anything because it just results in there being nothing. And this sense of kind of perpetually trying and failing to get anywhere is also sort of more generally prevalent in the poem through Larkin's use of epistrophe, or a kind of epistrophe, a pseudo-epistrophe you might say, and look at the way that he places the full stops in the poem. So epistrophe is the opposite of anaphora. An anaphora is how the poem started. So that's when you have repetition at the beginning of clauses. And epistrophe is the opposite. It's when you have repetition at the end of clauses or at the end of sentences. So a very famous example is Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's epistrophe because you've got the repetition of the people at the end of successive clauses. So how does Larkin use epistrophe in this poem? Well, if we look at where the full stops are, death comes at the end of each sentence. So, and each one gets more protracted. So we start at the end of the first stanza with slow dying. At the end of the next, which has moved kind of up into the fourth line of the second stanza. So we started in the first stanza with the end of the sentence coming in line 6, so life is slow dying at the end of line 6. Then in the second stanza, ways of slowly dying is at the end of line 4, and there's an increase there. So we had slow dying, now we've got slowly dying. And then at the end of the next sentence, which again is kind of more contracted, so now we're at the end of the third line of the third stanza, death equally slowly. And so again, it's even more protracted. So we've gone from slow dying to slowly dying to death equally slowly. It's getting kind of longer and longer and more protracted with the adding of the L and the Y sounds. So you've got one L and one Y in slow dying. You've then got two L's and two Y's in slowly dying. And then you've got there's more added in death equally slowly. So the additional L in equally and the additional Y in equally as well. I also think that use of the word equally here is going back to the idea of measuring. We've got the idea of measuring your time out, measuring your life out. It doesn't matter how you measure it. Death comes equally slowly. So there's that kind of measuring language, I think, in Larkin's use of the word equally here. And another way I think that Larkin is so clever in the way that he structures this is the juxtaposition of the protracted dying, so that you go from slow dying to slowly dying to death equally slowly, that gets more protracted, and yet structurally they come kind of closer and closer together. It's almost like however you try and string it out, death is coming, it can't be avoided. So those two play off each other. I think that even if you protract trying to describe death, it sort of comes closer in terms of lines. Another structural circularity in the poem is the cyclical sense of there being nothing to be said, because it is the title and it is the last line. I mean, they're almost like bookends, that you start with there being nothing to be said and then you end with there being nothing to be said. But here, I think, is an inherent paradox of the poem. And so I asked earlier if Larkin is just unbelievably bleak, that, there's nothing to be said because death is coming and that's the end of the matter. But I think that bleakness is just undermined in the fact that nothing to be said is the title and the end line of the poem, because obviously there is not nothing to be said, otherwise he wouldn't have written the poem. So if you have that thought, well, there's nothing to be said, I might as well just count down the minutes until I die, then you wouldn't write a poem about there being nothing to be said. You're saying how you feel within the poem, so there is something to be said. There are your feelings about the approach of death. That is the thing to be said. So is Philip Larkin as bleak as he might at first appear? Well, no, I don't think he is, and I think there are two reasons for that. The first is that there is some solace, I think, in this poem from the sense of the collective, which you can see from the proliferation of plurals throughout, and that there is no narrative I. There is no single speaking voice kind of removed from the rest. Everything is included in this kind of plural way of thinking about the world, of thinking about everyone within the world, that everyone belongs to nations and or nomads and or tribes and or families, that this applies to all. And as Larkin said, what he's looking to describe in his poetry is the same experience or a feeling, a kind of collective feeling that all people in all times can feel. And that, I think, is it's not bleak, because there's hope in kind of collective feeling being comforting or soothing to some extent. The other reason I don't think it's as bleak as it at first appears is because, as I kind of closed with saying, there is a sense that there isn't nothing to be said because the poem exists. So there is art, there is expressing one's feelings about the fact that you know that death is coming. Okay, you know that death is coming, but are you going to measure your money? Is that what you're going to spend your time doing? Or are you going to spend it reading poetry, thinking about poetry, kind of expressing the way that you feel about these, what might be seen in other ways as kind of abstract metaphysical concerns? Thank you very much indeed for listening. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you've liked the video, then do please press the like button. It does help me out in YouTube's algorithm. And I'd love to know your response to Philip Larkin, his poetic style, and this poem in particular. What do you think of Nothing to be Said? Do you think, in fact, there are many things to be said?